Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we have a bit of a fun video. I thought I would make a top things you will definitely go through or experience when you decide to grow orchids as a serious hobby. And I came up with 9 of them. As we start to grow more and more orchids of different varieties, inevitably we do encounter some stuff that are inevitable at the end of the day. So given enough time, these are the top 9 things that I am pretty sure at some point you will go through. Number 1, the setback orchid. Just like any other plant, orchids grow continuously, and some of them never actually take a break. They continuously grow throughout the year, and even if they go through a blooming season, they actually never go dormant, never lose leaves. They are pretty much evergreen. When we purchase orchids, we usually get them at a pretty young stage or just mature. And this is a perfect example of that. This is a sympodial orchid, which grows by creating new canes or pseudobulbs every year. And you can see they kind of grow from tiny to pretty large. A setback orchid, as the name suggests, is an orchid that is resetted back in time in a way, meaning the new growth that is produced will not grow to be as tall as the previous one as it should grow. The effect of that is not only visual, but it also means that the orchid might not bloom in her following season or when she's supposed to bloom, meaning you'll have to wait a lot more for flowers. This is a pretty frustrating phenomenon in the orchid hobby, but I assure you we all go through it. And it's not only sympodial orchids such as this cattleya that go through it, it's also monopodial orchids such as Phalaenopsis. In their case, we are dealing with smaller leaves. Now, why does this happen? Well, it's all about initial stress. Just like other houseplants might go through transplant shock, orchids can sometimes go through environment shock. When they're growing in their nursery and even at the store, they have a totally different environment than that of your home. Also, in the store, the orchid might have been neglected, might have not been watered, light might have been lacking, and all sorts of other stress factors. This all leads up to smaller new growth on pretty much any orchid. Depends on the orchid how it has been treated at the store and also how it has been repotted, because disturbance of the roots can lead to setback as well. So pretty much any way you can disturb an orchid will cause it to be set back and delay reblooming for you. In very serious cases, it can put the health of the orchid in danger as well, but that's a different story. The second thing you will likely encounter is a non-blooming orchid. Especially at the beginning, we do our orchid shopping in the garden centers, flower shops, even supermarkets, right? Well, these places mainly sell orchids in bloom, and at some point the blooms will fall. And then months and months upon months will pass and our orchid will not bloom again. Now, why does this happen and how we can remedy it? Well, first of all, the most common reason why you will encounter a non-blooming orchid is very simple and very curable. You simply didn't wait long enough. Now, the most common orchid is the Phalaenopsis orchid that I have here. As it just so happens, this orchid only blooms once a year. You might have side branches or the existing flower spike continuing growth and blooming again, but new flower spikes are mainly produced once a year, and usually in autumn or winter when temperatures decrease. Other orchids don't necessarily have a season, but many of them might bloom once a year or at most twice or 3 times a year. So first of all, you have to think about the time that passed ever since you purchased your orchid in bloom. Maybe it's just as simple as not waiting enough for its season to come. Another very common reason why your orchid doesn't want to bloom is the setback that I talked about earlier. Some orchids get set back after you purchase them, maybe even after you repot them. When they're set back, they don't have enough energy to allocate to different structures. They will prioritize roots and new growth, and they will leave flowering on a second plan. So maybe your orchid is set back, it doesn't have enough energy, so it cannot actually put up a flower spike. Case in which all you need to do is just care for that orchid properly, see it flourish once again and grow bigger and bigger structures, and when it's time to bloom, it will bloom. With proper care and taking into account its growth habit and pattern, all orchids should bloom. The third thing you will sadly but definitely encounter with orchids given long enough time is pests. Just like any other plant, orchids can be attacked by insects or snails or slugs. Now, the most common orchid pests are, in order of experience, but you might get them in a different order, snails in the potting medium, and this is something very common here in Europe. Bush snails are really tiny and almost invisible to the eye if you don't know what to look for. However, though, they can make so much damage, and I cannot tell you how many orchids I set back or I even lost because of the bush snails before I figured out how to get rid of them, how to spot them, how to see the damage, and so on. For this very reason, you'll find in the description more information on slugs and snails and how to see the damage. I'll also share with you my way of getting rid of them. As far as insects or arachnids go, orchids can have a various array of pests. My second most common pest is the spider mite, and there are two versions of the spider mite. An easy one called the two-spotted spider mite, which goes away with a bit of showering and some insecticidal soap, and the nasty one, which is the red spider mite or false spider mite, which goes away with almost nothing. After 2 years of battle, I did discover how to get rid of this spider mite, so again, I'll link you down below to my experiences with this pest, but other pests can include mealybugs, scale can be bad as well, but I didn't have major issues yet, and also thrips, which again can be very bad, but I didn't really have issues with it, so I don't have what to share with you in regards of thrips. The best thing to do when we purchase new orchids is to quarantine them, meaning keeping them somewhere separate. It would be ideal if we could keep them in a different room for about a month and a half, and in this time check on the orchid and see if we find any weird spotting on the leaves, the orchid simply declining for no reason, and things of the sorts. But as I was saying, you will have more information on different pests in the description below, and of course you will see there how the damage looks like and what you should look for. The fourth issue that you will inevitably experience with orchids is spots on the leaves, and this can be quite the scary thing to see. But not all spots are bad. So first, let's start with something that is not bad. Many orchids have natural freckles. These are pigment spots that do tend to intensify the brighter the light is. Vanda orchids can have spots, oncidiums can have spots, even some phalaenopsis. Usually these spots are not brown or black, they are deep purple. A good thing to do is to Google your orchid and see how it looks like for other people. If others have spots and freckles, and sometimes even big patches of purple on their leaves, then you should be pretty much okay. Other spots and patterns can be caused by pests, but you will see more about that in the description below when I talk about pests. Sometimes infections, such as bacterial infections or fungal infections, can attack leaves. But in this case, that damage tends to extend. I'll link you down below to my video of treating such ailments, but the key word here is spreading. If spots or damages tend to spread throughout the leaf, you see them every day advance more and more, then it's time to take action, and pretty much in most cases you should cut the leaf off. If the damage, however, does not spread, well, it might have been caused by an infection, but orchids are very capable of dealing with infections themselves as well. Not in all cases though. But many of the times, many orchids do present spots that simply are there, they don't do anything. In my case, in this cattleya, this spot is about 2 or 3 years old, but it didn't extend in 3 years. All of the new growths look perfectly fine, and now the orchid is blooming. I personally think it is a better idea not to chop off all of the leaves simply because we saw a tiny little spot. Leaves have their very important function as well, which I talk about in a different video, you'll find it down below. Without leaves, the orchid cannot produce energy, cannot photosynthesize. So if we chop down all of the leaves, how can our orchid have energy to grow, right? My philosophy is always keeping leaves if they don't endanger the plant. If it's an infection, remove the leaf. If not, if it doesn't spread, just keep it. It doesn't look good, but it does help the orchid. In time, you can actually remove it. At this point, I can easily remove this leaf from my orchid because I have a lot of leaves. But if I only had this leaf and another one, definitely I would not remove it. And lastly, leaves can have mechanical damage. In my case, I have cut here the tip of the leaf because I tested this orchid for a virus when I saw this pattern. She's clean, so this is not a virus, nothing to worry about. But some orchids, especially new orchids, might have scratches on their leaves or even completely broken leaves, missing parts of the leaf. That's usually okay. If there isn't a secondary infection, there's nothing to worry about. If the leaf is dried at the breaking point, everything is okay. You can also encounter sunburns, which are caused by high temperature and exposure to sunshine, direct sun that is, that heated up the leaf. Other markings caused by edema, which is usually the result of watering with very cold water, and so on. These are nothing to worry about really. They're more aesthetical problems than anything else. And remember the rule, if it spreads, then you need to intervene. If it doesn't spread, then maybe don't panic, don't cut the leaf, and keep an eye out and see how it does in the future. We are up to number 5, so more than half of our top is gone. The 5th most common problem is root rot. Now, root rot is pretty much an effect in my opinion. We can have all sorts of issues with the roots that may cause them to die off. However, root rot usually happens due to suffocation, especially with new orchids that are grown in organic medium. These orchids have been potted in this medium most probably a long time ago, and by now the medium is broken down, is acidic, it doesn't maintain its shape and structure, and it's simply suffocating the roots. The roots cannot breathe. Therefore, they just die off due to suffocation. And of course, if they're dead, any organic tissue goes into decomposition, aka rotting, and thus the name root rot. So suffocation, in my opinion, is the main cause. We can also have pest damage. If roots are damaged by pest enough, up to the point of not being able to function and sustain themselves, they will die off and they will start to decompose. Also, especially in stores, orchids might not be watered in time and roots might actually desiccate and die off. And then when we water them, we actually water dead organic tissue, which starts to decompose and rot once again. So as you can see, there might be various reasons why roots can die off and start to rot. For this reason, I do prefer and advise new orchids to be repotted into fresh medium. If you want to use organic medium, that's perfectly fine. Just opt for fresh bark or fresh sphagnum moss. But if you prefer clay medium, then you can absolutely transfer this orchid at this time. And as you saw when we talked about pests, I do have a routine with repotting and getting rid of snails. So repotting new orchids takes care of the bad medium, suffocation issues, pest issues, all of those nasty stuff. And personally, I repot every new orchid pretty soon after I purchase it, of course depending on the orchid. The 6th thing you will definitely encounter when growing orchids is a more light-hearted thing, let's say, is broken flower spikes. So we're past the beginning stages, we know how to control the pests, the ailments, the new orchids, repotting and so on. Everything is going great until one day our orchid decides to produce a flower spike and we decide to bump into it and just damage the flower spike and break it. Don't worry, it is incredibly frustrating, yes, but we all go through it, especially when we have a lot of orchids into a tiny place. Putting the spikes in water is not necessarily the best of things. Most of them won't last all that well, but dendrobiums are really good cut flowers. If you break the spike of a dendrobium phalaenopsis, this type, definitely put it in a vase. I bet you it will continue to bloom. Phalaenopsis, so-and-so. Sometimes they will bloom a few flowers, but not all of the buds. Sometimes they will just drop all of the buds. Vandas, it can work, but again, I wouldn't keep my hopes high, and things like Miltoniopsis and Nellie Eiler, pretty much no, they will not survive in a vase. But of course, it's a flower spike and you should definitely try to put it in water. However though, if the flower spike is not completely broken, we might be able to fix it. So I'll link you down below to a video in which I snap a Phalaenopsis flower spike and I still maintain it attached to the orchid. The spike still bloomed, everything was okay. It was just a scary experience. So check the link down below, I hope it will help you out. But if you manage to break a few flower spikes in your life, don't worry, join the club, get some cookies from the right. We're all having a good time here and we're mourning our flower spikes. The 7th thing you will definitely encounter with orchids at some point or another is a bad smell. Now orchids themselves, they don't smell bad. They actually smell good, those that are fragrant. What smells bad is decomposing medium or rotten roots or dead algae or stuff of the sorts. Things that we don't necessarily want in our medium, but sometimes they do happen, particularly with new orchids that have very old organic medium. When you water orchids and you feel this chemically pretty foul smell, it's time to repot that orchid because the organic medium, which can be bark, coconut husk, or sphagnum moss, is definitely broken down. Now, if the medium is fresh, or if you're using inorganic medium such as clay medium and you still smell that foul smell, definitely the roots are decomposing, they're dead inside the medium. You should definitely address it, because anything that decomposes in an orchid pot will acidify the environment and it will leach off substances that can affect and can burn the existing good roots. So the rule of thumb is, if you feel bad smells coming from your pot, whatever medium you're using, you need to intervene, because most probably there's something decomposing in there, whether it's medium or roots. You need to check it out. The eighth thing you will definitely encounter with orchids is aerial roots. Now, to clarify a little bit, aerial roots are these roots that grow outside of the pot. Technically though, it's a little bit incorrect. Aerial roots are produced by epiphytic orchids, and in nature they don't grow in pots or contained in anything. All of their roots are aerial because they have direct contact with air at all times. But just for ease of conversation, that's what we refer to. We're not necessarily being politically correct. All epiphytic orchids such as Cattleyas, Phalaenopsis, Oncidiums, Dendrobiums, Vandas, if you grow them potted, they will all produce aerial roots, which will grow out of the pot and head in all directions. There is actually no pattern of growth with aerial roots. I did discover though that they do tend to avoid light, so they grow away from the window. Other than that though, they will grow up, down, to the sides, and sometimes even reach extensive lengths. Now, what to do with these aerial roots? Simple, let them be. I know there are people who like to cut them, but it's kind of wrong to do so. Whenever you cut any structure of an orchid, you are opening up a wound which can get affected with airborne pathogens which are present in any environment. Some people cut them to promote some branching out, because roots, if they snap or break, they can pretty much create a few branches. If you overdo this, you're just forcing your orchid to allocate energy into all of these branches, created new growth points, developing the growth points and all of that, when the orchid might actually have to allocate energy to new growth or leaves or even flower spikes. So I personally wouldn't really cut the roots. I know they might be a little unsightly, but to be fairly honest, whoever comes in my greenhouse is fascinated by all of these roots, particularly on my Vandas, which have all of their roots outside. And it is the visual feature that sets these orchids apart from all of the other plants. And also, aerial roots serve as plan B. What if something happens to the roots inside your pot? You might be a master of watering, but when you go away for 2 weeks on vacation and your neighbor or somebody you know waters your orchids and doesn't do a good job at it, the roots inside the pot are at risk to get suffocated. If they die off, you will only be left with the aerial roots to hydrate the orchid. What if you don't have aerial roots? And thus, if you were thinking of cutting the aerial roots because you don't like them, maybe you might want to reconsider. And here we are at the end of the video. Up until now, I kind of talked about the, let's say, bad things that can happen. And this is because I find them to be the most important and the most educative and helpful. But it's not all bad. And actually, the ninth thing you will go through when growing orchids is a lot of fun. Now, because orchids are not terrestrial, most of the ones that we grow are epiphytic or semi-terrestrial. This gives us freedom in the setup in which we grow them. And you might know that many different people choose many different setups to grow them in. I like semi-hydroponics and clay medium. I also keep my Vandas bare-rooted. Well, in a pot, but there's not much medium in that pot, if at all. And this is a way of expressing ourselves at the end of the day, or at least customizing the way we grow and care for these beauties. Customizing our experience at the end of the day and expressing ourselves. And that makes everything so fun. Orchids have personality, in my opinion. Quotation marks, of course. The way they grow, their flowers, their fragrances, all of them, I just find them unique and extremely different from any other plants. And the orchids themselves, plus the way we grow them, in my opinion, equals a lot of fun. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and you know the drill. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!